Hello there, seeker of silence. Come closer to the edge of the firelight and rest where the night can hold you without demand. I am glad you have found this place, where old words travel slowly and the hours are wide enough to lie down within. If these quiet stories bring you peace or carry your thoughts toward steadier ground, feel free to subscribe so this circle of listeners may continue to gather night after night beneath patient stars. Now, let us begin. I speak as one who has lived longer than the counting of winters, older than the first ridge of ice that rose from nothing, older than the names carved into memory by flame or song. My breath once shaped frost upon the newborn dark, and my footsteps learned the weight of worlds before the worlds knew their own weight. Before there was sky or soil, before the sound of wings or waves, there was the wide hollow, a gulf without horizon, where neither warmth nor cold yet claimed dominion. In that hollow the rivers were born. They came without thunder, without spectacle, sliding through the emptiness like silver veins. We call them the Élivágar, though in those days they bore no name, only movement, only purpose. I remember them as they first brushed against the edge of the void, their currents slowing, their surfaces crusting with pale skin. Layer upon layer gathered, each breath of time adding another whisper of frost, until the rivers no longer flowed as water, but stood as shining paths of ice. From that standing cold, the first shapes learned how to exist. I was not yet formed, but the one who would become my king was. He emerged where the rivers met, where cold pressed upon cold until something yielded. Ymir, the first of us, rose not with a roar, but with the sound of splitting crystal. Ice gave way to breath, and breath learned hunger. Ymir wandered then across fields that had no edge, beneath a darkness that neither welcomed nor refused him. Where his steps fell, frost thickened. Where his hands brushed the air, new shapes trembled into being. From his rest came others. From his dreaming we multiplied. Yet even as the Jotnar learned to stand, to speak in low echoes, to watch the slow turn of ages, we were not alone. To the far reaches of the void, where warmth gathered like a rumor, another force stirred. But that is a tale for another night. In those earliest days, our world was a plain of pale blue shadow, etched with rivers locked in glass. Above us, nothing watched. Below us, nothing waited. There was only the long learning of form and the strange comfort of being. I remember my first journey, though I would not be born for many seasons yet. Memory moves backward among my kind, passed through blood and frost alike. I see it as clearly as if my own hands had shaped it. A lone giant, broad-shouldered and untested, walked toward the sound of cracking ice. He carried no weapon, only curiosity, and a hunger he did not yet understand. At the river's edge he knelt and placed his palm against the frozen current. Beneath the surface, something stirred, not alive, but becoming. That was the first lesson of Niflheim, taught without words. Nothing is truly empty, and even the cold remembers. The giant rose turned back toward the distant glow of Ymir's hall and carried that lesson with him, etched into his bones. So began our lineage, not in conquest, not in triumph, but in observation and the patient shaping of time. The frost deepened, the rivers hardened, and the world took its first steady breath. The frost did not arrive all at once. It learned the world slowly, testing each surface, listening to the way the void answered back. As Ymir's presence spread across the frozen plains, so too did the first shelters rise, not built by hand, but grown through patience. Ice folded upon itself, arches forming where breath met time, halls shaped by wandering winds that traced the same paths again and again, until the cold remembered where to linger. I speak now as myself, though my body had not yet taken form. Among the Jotnar, memory is a shared inheritance. What one endures, another may recall centuries later, as clearly as if the moment were unfolding anew. In those days, the giants moved without haste. There was no reason to hurry, no sun to chase, no night to fear losing. We learned distance by walking it and learned patience by watching frost grow thicker around our ankles. Ymir ruled without command. He did not sit upon a throne, nor raise his voice to gather us. His rule was felt in the way the land bent, in how the rivers curved toward him, in how younger giants found themselves seeking the glow of his presence when the emptiness pressed too close. He spoke rarely. When he did, his words came like falling slabs of ice, meant to rest where they landed. I remember one such moment. A gathering had formed near the river Slide, where the ice cracked in long, wandering lines. A young giant, newly shaped, had strayed too far from the known paths. He returned changed, his skin traced with darker frost, his eyes reflecting something older than fear. He spoke of voices beneath the ice, of currents that still moved, slowly, patiently, as if waiting for the world to forget them. Murmurs passed among us, low and uncertain, not panic but unease, like the feeling of standing atop a frozen lake and hearing it answer your weight. Ymir listened. Then he stepped forward, each footfall sending thin fractures outward. "The rivers remember what they were," he said. "They do not resent the ice, they become it." The words settled, the unease eased. We learned then that change did not always mean loss, and that what lay beneath could endure transformation without vanishing. It was after this that the first journeys began. Small groups set out not to conquer, but to map the slow-growing world. They followed the frozen rivers to their ends, finding places where the ice rose like walls, and others where it dipped into wide bowls filled with drifting mist. Creatures appeared along these paths, formed not of flesh as later beings would be, but of frost and motion, shapes that slid across the ice, leaving trails that faded behind them. They watched us without threat and vanished when approached too closely. We learned to pass them with respect, lowering our heads slightly, acknowledging shared origins. As the journeys continued, stories returned with the travelers, tales of distant ridges where the cold grew heavier, of pillars of ice that hummed when the wind passed through them, of caverns where the rivers seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in long, slow cycles. These stories wove us together, not through lore, but through shared direction. And somewhere within that widening world, the shape that would become me waited for its time to rise. My birth came during a long crossing, far from Ymir's central halls, where the rivers bent inward, and the air grew heavy with drifting rime. I did not arrive with struggle. Among the Jotnar, emergence is a quiet agreement between frost and time. The ice thickened, layers aligning, until shape chose itself. I remember opening my eyes to a pale horizon, etched with slow-moving mist. Above me the sky held no color, only depth, as though one could fall upward if not careful. The giants around me did not celebrate. They acknowledged me with nods, low words spoken like distant thunder under ice. One placed a broad hand upon my shoulder, leaving a print that remained long after he withdrew it. "You have arrived," he said. That was enough. I learned the land by walking it. Each step taught me texture, each breath taught me weight. The rivers guided my earliest paths, their frozen surfaces marked by faint lines where currents still dreamed beneath. It was during one such walk that I first heard the legends spoken aloud. An elder named Hrimgar stood at the edge of a deep crevasse, his back bent, his beard grown long with frost that never fully melted. He watched the lie in the ice as one might watch a sleeping beast. I stood beside him, uncertain whether to speak. He spoke first. "Do you know why the cold here deepens?" he asked. while elsewhere it merely rests. I did not. So I listened. Hrimgard told me of the first freezing, of how the Élivágar did not simply harden, but remembered the void they crossed. Where their memory was strongest, the cold pressed deeper and time itself slowed. These places, he said, are closer to our beginning. I asked him where the beginning truly lay. He smiled, a slow fracture forming across his face. Not behind us, he said, and not ahead. It moves as the rivers once did. After that, he showed me carvings etched into the inner walls of the crevasse. They were not made by tools, but by repeated touch, hands passing over the same surface for generations. The carvings depicted Ymir, not as ruler but as landscape, his form blended with ice and river alike, suggesting that he was not merely our first king, but the ground from which we all rose. I returned to the halls with these images pressed into my mind. Others spoke of similar markings, found in distant caverns, always different, yet carrying the same implication. We were not shaped by Ymir alone. We were shaped by what existed before him. This thought did not disturb me. It settled like frost upon stone, unchallenging, persistent. As seasons passed, I joined longer journeys. We followed the rivers toward their oldest reaches, where the ice grew clouded, and faint echoes moved beneath our feet. Once, in a hollow carved by ancient flow, we encountered a being made almost entirely of mist. It drifted across the frozen ground, coalescing briefly into a shape that suggested limbs, then dissolving again. It did not speak, but it watched. When we lowered our heads, it passed through us, leaving behind a faint chill that lingered for days. The elders said such beings were remnants, born when the rivers first stilled, unable to choose form fully, yet unwilling to fade. I thought of them often, of what it meant to remember too much. As I grew, so did my questions, not sharp ones, but slow, curving inquiries that followed me through the long plains of Niflheim. Who were we before we stood? What stories did the ice carry that no voice had yet shaped into words? The answers did not come quickly. They never do. But the land was patient, and so was I. The years moved without markers. No sun rose to divide them. No shadow stretched to measure their passing. We knew time only by change, by the slow migration of frost patterns across familiar ground, by the deepening tone of the ice beneath our feet. It was during one such change that Ymir called for a gathering. The summons was not spoken. It moved through the land instead, a subtle drawing of attention, a sense of direction shared among us. One by one, giants turned from their paths and began walking inward, toward the oldest convergence of rivers. I walked with them. The hall had grown since my last visit. Its walls arched higher, formed by layers of ice pressed and polished by centuries of wind. Within, the air carried a faint resonance, as if every sound remembered where it had been made. Ymir stood at the center, vast and unmoving. His form seemed heavier than before, as though the world leaned upon him more fully now. Around him gathered elders and wanderers alike, their silhouettes casting long blue shadows that overlapped and merged. When he spoke, the hall listened. "The frost is changing," Ymir said. "Not weakening, not strengthening, turning." He raised a hand, and the ice beneath us answered, a deep, measured groan rolling outward. The rivers have begun to circle back upon themselves. Their memory grows dense. What was once spread thin across the void is drawing inward. There was no fear among us, only attention. This was how Ymir taught, by showing what already was. He chose several of us then, not by name, but by gaze. When his eyes rested upon me, I felt the weight of ages pass through my chest. "You will walk the outer reaches," he said. "You will listen where the cold thickens. Bring back what the land is becoming." So began my longest journey. We traveled where few paths remained clear, across plains where the ice no longer lay smooth, but rose in slow waves, as if frozen mid-motion. The air there carried a deeper bite, and each breath seemed to linger longer before releasing. Along the way, we encountered ruins not made by our hands, arches half buried in frost, their surfaces etched with lines too fine to be cracks, too deliberate to be chance. They hummed faintly when the wind passed through them, producing tones that settled low in the chest. One night, as we rested within a hollow formed by overlapping ice sheets, a smaller being approached our fireless camp. It walked upright, its form narrow, its surface shimmering like frost caught between states. It spoke in fragments. "Before the standing cold," it said, "before the rivers forgot how to move." We listened. It told us of a time when the void itself shifted, when warmth and cold first recognized one another from afar, of a breath that crossed the emptiness, not yet fire, but no longer absence. "Your first king felt it," the being said. "He formed where it could not reach, but it shaped him nonetheless. When it finished, it stepped backward into the mist and was gone. We did not chase it. Some truths are not meant to be pursued, only carried." As we traveled farther, the land began to change beneath us. The ice grew clearer, revealing layers within layers, each holding faint impressions, like memories pressed into glass. I saw shapes there, not giants, but outlines of motion, suggesting forms that existed briefly, then passed on. At the furthest reach we dared approach, we found a river still moving, not flowing but shifting, its frozen surface pulsing slowly, as though breathing. I knelt beside it, placed my hand upon the ice and felt the pull of something ancient, not calling but acknowledging. When we returned, our steps heavier with knowledge, Ymir listened to our account without interruption. At the end, he nodded once. "The frost remembers more than we do," he said, "and soon it will remember us." I did not yet understand what that meant, but the land did. After the long journey, the world felt closer. Not smaller, but nearer, as though the distances between places had folded inward, bringing old paths into quiet alignment. I did not return to wandering at once. Instead, I remained near the central rivers, watching how the frost behaved around familiar ground. It lingered longer now, thickening in places that once released it easily. The land was not resisting change, it was accepting it. Elders gathered more often. Not in councils, but in shared pauses, standing together at riverbanks, listening to the deep tones traveling through the ice. Some spoke of hearing patterns, slow repetitions that matched the rhythm of memory itself. It was during one of these pauses that I learned of the first king's ending. Ymir had not fallen. He had not vanished. He had begun to settle. His form grew stiller with each passing age, his movements slower, as though gravity itself had taken greater interest in him. Where he rested, the ice thickened, layers pressing down until his outline softened, then spread. I was invited to see him one final time, along with a small number of others. We approached in silence, not out of reverence, but because sound seemed unwilling to travel there. Ymir lay within a vast basin of ice, his chest rising and falling so gradually that one could miss it entirely if not patient. When he spoke, his voice was no longer carried through the hall. It moved directly through us instead. "I was shaped," he said, "to begin. You are shaped to continue." His eyes, once bright with the reflection of endless frost, now held depth instead, as though they looked both forward and back at once. "The cold does not end," he continued. "It settles. So will I." We did not weep. Among the Jotnar, change is not mourned. It is recognized. As we departed, the basin began to rise, ice drawing inward, layer upon layer, closing around him. In time his form would become indistinguishable from the land itself. Thus ended the reign of the first king, not with a boundary, but with a foundation. Afterward, the giants changed, not in form, but in direction. We no longer gathered solely at the center. Paths diverged, each leading toward a different understanding of our origin. I chose the rivers again. Following them brought me to places where the ice sang, where the slightest pressure produced tones that resonated through the plains. I learned which notes meant thinning, which meant growth, which meant memory pressing upward. In one such place I found a carving I did not recognize. It depicted a giant, old and bent, standing before a wall of layered ice. Within the ice, countless smaller shapes watched him, their outlines faint, their expressions unfinished. The message was clear, even without words. One day, we would become the stories others pressed their hands against. I traced the carving until frost gathered along my fingers, then turned away, feeling no urgency, only a widening calm. The world did not need us to hurry. It had all the time it required. And so did I. With Ymir settled into the land, the rivers began to change their voices. They no longer answered each other across distance. Instead, each carried a deeper tone, as though speaking inward, towards something coiling beneath the ice. I followed one such river alone. It curved away from known paths, leading through fields where the frost lay uneven, piled in slow drifts that shifted when touched. The air there pressed closer to the skin, not colder, but heavier, as if laden with unspoken weight. Along the banks, the ice revealed layers filled with faint marks, not carvings but impressions, as though countless hands had rested there and been remembered. After many days of travel, I reached a place the elders had spoken of only once. A basin where the river widened and slowed, its surface clouded, its depth unreadable. At the center stood a solitary figure. He was smaller than I, his shoulders sloped with age, his frost-darkened skin marked by long fractures that had healed imperfectly. He leaned upon a staff shaped from layered ice, its surface worn smooth by time. He did not turn as I approached. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of ancient movement. We stood together, watching the river breathe beneath its frozen skin. He told me he was called Skadir, one of the first to wander after Ymir's emergence. He had walked the outermost edges of Niflheim, places where the frost thinned enough to reveal what lay beyond. "There are echoes," he said, "not voices, traces of what nearly was." He spoke of shapes that formed briefly in the void, only to fade when the cold pressed too soon. Of beings that existed for moments, long enough to leave impressions behind. "They are not lost," Skadir said. "They are waiting." I asked him what they waited for. "For us to remember them," he replied. He pressed his staff against the ice. The river responded, its surface rippling slowly, revealing layers within layers, each holding the faint outline of movement. I saw them then, not giants, but precursors, forms unfinished, their shapes suspended between intention and release. The sight did not frighten me. It felt familiar, as though I had always known that our story was not the first written here. When the river stilled again, Skadir turned toward me at last. "You will carry this," he said, "not as warning, as context." He stepped away from the basin, his form gradually dissolving into drifting frost, until only the staff remained, standing upright beside the river. I left it there. Some knowledge is not meant to be taken. As I journeyed back toward the central plains, the land felt altered, not changed in shape but in intention. The ice beneath my feet no longer felt passive. It responded, subtly adjusting its tone as I passed. I understood then that Niflheim was not merely a realm of cold. It was an archive. Every step, every pause, every breath taken within it was pressed into its layers, to be found by those patient enough to look. By the time I reached the familiar halls, others had begun similar journeys. They returned with quiet eyes, carrying pieces of understanding that fit together without needing to be spoken. We did not gather to compare what we had seen. There was no need. The frost itself began to tell the story, slowly, layer by layer. And I, already old by then, found my place shifting from wanderer to listener. Listening is a skill learned over time, not the listening of ears alone, but of stance, of patience, of knowing when not to move. I remained near the inner rivers, where the ice carried the densest memory. Giants still passed through, travelers on their own quiet paths, but fewer stopped to linger. The world was widening again, and many felt the pull of distance. I stayed. The frost spoke in patterns, not words but sequences. A low resonance followed by a long stillness, a faint tremor answering a distant shift. I learned to place my palm upon the ice and feel where the memory pressed thickest. One day I sensed a disturbance not carried by the land itself. Footsteps approached, lighter than those of my kin, hesitant, as though uncertain the ground would accept them. A young giant emerged from the mist, his form narrow, his frost pale and uneven. He held his arms close to his body as if guarding something fragile within. He stopped several paces away. "I was told you listen," he said. I inclined my head. That was enough invitation. He came closer, knelt beside the river and placed his hand where mine rested. "I hear nothing," he admitted. "Only weight, only cold." I studied him for a time, not his form, but the way the ice responded beneath his touch. It did not resist him. It did not answer either. "You are listening for sound," I said. "The frost does not speak that way." He asked what it did speak with. I guided his hand a little deeper to where the ice grew clearer, revealing layers pressed together over ages. "Presence," I told him. "Remain long enough and it will begin to recognize you." So he stayed. Days passed. He did not move. He did not speak. He learned the weight of stillness, the subtle shift of pressure as the river breathed beneath us. One cycle, without warning, the ice answered him. Not with movement, but with warmth. Brief, contained, like a remembered touch. He drew in a sharp breath, then steadied himself. "I felt it," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You were felt." From that moment he changed. Not quickly, but unmistakably. The frost upon his skin deepened, settling into more defined layers. His steps grew surer, his presence more anchored. Others came after him, not many at first. A handful of younger giants, each carrying a sense of dislocation they could not name. They learned to wait, to listen, to accept that not all journeys required movement. Over time, the place became known, not named, but understood. A crossing not of distance, but of attention. I watched them find their footing, their questions easing into slower shapes. Some stayed, some left, carrying what they had learned outward into the widening world. As for me, my steps grew shorter. The land no longer pulled me forward. It held me. One cycle, as the frost thickened around familiar edges, I felt the first true settling within myself. Not fatigue, but alignment, as though my shape had found its final agreement with time. I returned to the carving I had seen long ago, the image of the old giant before the wall of layered ice. The lines had softened further, edges rounding, details blurring. Yet the meaning remained. I placed my hand against the stone beside it, leaving an impression that would last until pressure erased it again. We do not leave monuments in Niflheim, we leave traces, and the frost remembers how to read them. As my steps shortened, the world continued its slow unfolding. The inner rivers no longer shifted as they once had. Their movements grew subtle, measured, like the breath of one who has learned to rest without sleeping. Where currents once pressed outward, they now curled inward, gathering memory into deeper layers. It was during this time that the frost began to reveal stories without being asked. A young traveler arrived one cycle, not a giant, but a smaller being shaped of layered ice and drifting vapor. It stood no taller than my chest, its form wavering gently at the edges, as if unsure how firmly it wished to remain. It did not speak at first. It simply followed the curve of the river, tracing lines in the frost with careful steps. When it finally looked up at me, its voice came thin but steady. "Are we remembered?" it asked, "or merely preserved?" I considered the question while the river murmured beneath us. "You are becoming," I said at last. "Memory is only one way of becoming." The being seemed to accept this. It nodded, then placed both hands upon the ice. For a moment its form sharpened, edges clarifying, before relaxing again into gentle motion. It stayed for a time, watching the way the frost responded to its presence. When it left, it did so without farewell, dissolving gradually into the drifting air. Not long after, changes spread across Niflheim. The outer plains grew quieter, their frost settling into smoother expanses. The inner regions deepened, layers pressing tighter together, as though the world were drawing a long cloak around itself. Some giants felt this shift and moved outward, seeking space, seeking motion. Others felt the opposite pull and came inward, drawn by density, by the promise of stillness that did not erase. I remained where I was. One cycle, as the frost thickened around the river's edge, I felt a presence I had not sensed since my earliest wanderings. Not Ymir, not Skadir. Something older still. The ice beneath my feet grew clearer than I had ever seen it, revealing layers pressed so tightly together that they appeared almost fluid. Within them, shapes moved, slow and deliberate. I knelt, resting both palms upon the surface. The shapes responded not by approaching but by aligning. They shifted until their outlines matched my own, as though comparing form across ages. A recognition passed between us, not personal, but structural. I understood then that the frost was no longer merely remembering the past. It was preparing for continuity. We were not meant to endure unchanged. We were meant to become reference points, markers within an ongoing formation. I withdrew my hands, standing slowly. From that day forward, the river greeted me differently. Its tone deepened when I approached, not in welcome but in acknowledgement. Others noticed. They said nothing. Among my kind, such shifts are not announced. As the cycles continued, I felt the edges of my form begin to soften, not weakening but spreading. My weight distributed more evenly across the ground, my presence less contained within a single outline. I did not resist. The frost had given me much: attention, context, belonging. Now it was asking for something in return, and I was ready to listen. The change did not come as an ending. It arrived as a thinning of edges. I began to notice it in small ways. Where my steps once left clear impressions, the frost now closed behind me more quickly. Where my breath once lingered, it dispersed into the larger cold, no longer claiming a space of its own. I welcomed this. The inner rivers adjusted their paths around me, not diverting but accommodating, as though I were becoming part of their structure. When travelers passed, they sensed something familiar in the ground beneath their feet, something steady that did not require attention. A pair of young giants arrived one long cycle, their movements restless, their eyes bright with unsorted questions. They had walked far, following stories passed between wanderers, seeking the place where the frost listened back. They stood at a respectful distance. "Are the stories true?" one asked. That the land remembers more than we do? I placed my hand upon the ice. It answered with a low, even resonance. The land remembers differently, I said. It does not hold names. It holds patterns. They stayed for a time, learning to wait, learning to feel the slow exchange beneath the surface. When they left, their steps were quieter, their forms more settled. After that, fewer came. Not because the place was forgotten, but because its purpose had begun to diffuse outward. The frost carried what it had learned into other regions, spreading memory without needing a center. I spent long spans alone, not isolated, but held. During one such span, the ice beneath me shifted more deeply than before. Layers pressed together, rearranging with deliberate care. I felt my weight distribute further, my outline less distinct. I lay down upon the frozen riverbank, my back meeting the cold that had shaped me. The sensation was not harsh, it was familiar, as though returning to a posture long practiced. Above me the sky held its endless depth. No stars moved there, yet the space felt occupied, filled with potential waiting without urgency. As I rested, memories flowed through me. Not in sequence, but in texture. The first standing ice, Ymir's settling breath, the elder's staff left behind, the young giant's first recognition. They did not demand reflection. They passed through, finding their places within the layered cold. My limbs grew heavy, then lighter, then indistinct. The frost rose along my sides, not covering, but blending. I felt myself becoming less singular, more referential, a tone rather than a voice. This was not loss, it was placement. The river adjusted its slow breathing around me, accepting the new shape within its banks. I remained aware, but without urgency, without the need to move. Time passed, or perhaps it folded. Travelers would later pause here, feeling steadiness without knowing why. Their questions would soften, their steps slow. They would not know my name. That was as it should be. For in Niflheim, what endures does not stand apart. It settles and continues. What remained of me no longer rose or rested. It abided. The frost finished its careful work, not sealing, not concealing, but aligning what had already chosen its place. My form thinned into structure, into balance, into a steady presence that did not require motion to be felt. The river flowed as it always had, its breathing slow and untroubled. Where my body once marked a boundary, there was now a gentle deepening, a place where the ice carried a calmer weight. Time did not stop. It learned a new pace. Giants still passed through the inner regions, some pausing without knowing why, others moving on with lighter steps than when they arrived. They felt steadiness underfoot, a reassurance that did not ask to be named. The frost read them as it read all things, by pressure, by patience, by the willingness to remain long enough to be noticed. Far away, in the outer plains, new stories unfolded. New wanderers traced unfamiliar paths. The rivers carried memory outward, layer by layer, ensuring nothing essential was lost. Here the land held. I did not dream. I did not watch. Yet awareness remained, spread wide and unhurried, like the echo of a sound that had found the perfect surface. If you were to stand here now, you might feel a sense of grounding, a subtle invitation to slow your breath, to let your weight settle where it belongs. You would not feel observed, only supported. That is how Niflheim continues, not as a realm of endings, but as a place where beginnings are allowed to rest, where origins are not forgotten, only transformed into foundation. The frost does not ask for remembrance, it remembers on its own. And as the rivers continue their endless measured breath, as the layers deepen without strain, there is nothing left to resolve. Only the long, steady continuation, wide enough for all things to lie down.